Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to ORF. Thank you. Welcome to ORF, and today we are discussing what I keep telling my friends we should not be discussing because nobody can predict what will happen tomorrow. The way things have been going on since the 12th of February, every day is bringing something new to the table. And I give all respect to our three brave panelists who are going to speak on this subject. Mr. Pankaj Saran, uh, Enola Cholan, and Dr. Vasily Kashin. Of course, it's a stellar panel, and I would not want to hear anything about Ukraine from anyone else. I think, Mr. Saran, Ambassador Saran, has served in Russia as the ambassador. He's also been India's Deputy National Security Advisor and is well in the know of what all is taking place in what we in India tend to call a small European war. But he knows all the details. And I will start this discussion by asking Mr. Saran to tell us what his vision of the past 1 week, what happened, what has changed. And of course, since he's so close to the Indian political decision making, even if he's not part of it anymore, ask him as to where does this all leave India?
Nandan, I just want to say I'm so grateful that you've invited me for this discussion. Also, whatever I'm going to say is in my personal capacity. It doesn't reflect anyone else's views except mine. And I was just looking at the question of the seminar that has been reflected on the poster, that will the war end? I was asking myself whether this is a rhetorical question or is it redundant, because I think by now, as far as I'm concerned, it's quite clear that the question to ask is not whether the war will end or not, because I think it will. The question to ask is how and what happens after, the day after, and what are the implications of this development, as you have said. So I would say that, look, if all of us who have watched the US election campaign for the last more than a year, including not just what candidate Trump said, but his senior advisors like Ramaswamy, etc., and other ideologues in the Republican Party, I think there was almost no doubt left that they had a very different view about the Ukraine war or conflict from the Democrats. And they were also very clear-headed about that view. So in their articulation, there was not much room left for doubt about where they stood. And what we are seeing in the last 4 weeks is simply the rollout of that whole ideological position that was articulated. And they never missed a chance to say and to repeat a few of the main things. And I was actually really struck by, as you said, the last 1 week, in my view, when we look back in time, I think two particular years are going to stand out in geopolitics and in the global affairs. One obviously is 2022 February, and the other is February 2025. So whereas in February 2022 you saw almost a cold start, I think in February 2025 you're going to see a cold halt or a cold stop or a hard stop to the war. And from what I can make out, the readouts from both Moscow and Washington of the Saudi talks leaves nothing to imagination. Firstly, both sides have expressed great satisfaction at the outcome. The press conference given by Mark Rubio, Mike Waltz, and the special envoy after the Saudi talks is absolutely crystal clear. So I think we have to be prepared and ready for a very, very early, let's say, a halt to the hostilities. And in my opinion, I think we are looking more at weeks rather than months. Uh, there is no doubt that there will be a very early meeting at the summit level between the two presidents. What has actually struck me is the clarity of the articulation by the trio in the press conference. But I think we are at a real inflection point in global affairs where and I don't know whether it's a fair comparison to make, but it sometimes reminds me of the Ronald Reagan moment of 1988 when he declared that the Soviet Union was no longer an evil empire, and he worked with Gorbachev to do whatever he did. So we just have to ask ourselves what is going to be the nature of the US-Russia relationship. From whatever I can make out, it's poised for a dramatic change. The Russians seem to be totally ready. The Americans are absolutely determined to push this through, regardless of the consequences for their European allies. And we are headed in a new territory altogether. So that's really the first point I wanted to make. Now, in that same press conference, what I was struck by was statements made by Mark Rubio, not once, but at least 3 or 4 times, when he was pressed by the journalist about what are the benefits of this approach to the United States. He described them in 3 clusters. He said it will be good for the US-Russia bilateral relationship. And he clearly suggested that the discussion is not just limited to Ukraine, but it goes to the whole gamut of how the United States and Russia are going to deal with each other across all spectrums, all domains, all regions, all issues. The second thing he kept repeating, and for me, which I found was the biggest takeaway, was it will have major geopolitical ramifications. And the third thing which he talked about, of course, was the immense economic opportunities that will open up. Now, I just want to pick on his reference repeatedly, not once, but repeatedly, to the geopolitical implications of what we are living through. And to me, that is a code word for the relationship and how to handle China. And if we are moving, and if the thought process is, for example, that the global Western order, which was established post-World War and which has been in existence and created, has ironically and paradoxically benefited no one else, neither the Americans, nor the Russians, nor the Europeans, but the Chinese. And if the proposition is that we need to change this global order from an American perspective, and again, I would refer to Rubio's remarks at the Senate confirmation hearing, which I would, encourage everyone to read line by line, which is the single, before the Munich Security Conference, it's the most devastating attack on the liberal global world order as we know it, and on globalization, and on the whole concept of global free trade, etc. So if this is where they're coming from, then we are actually at an even more significant cusp of a strategy which is not limited just to Ukraine, but to the larger arrangement of the relationship between the United States, Russia, and China. And to me, that for us, for India, is a much more significant aspect than the terms on which Ukraine will be settled. Rubio refused to get into those details about territory and security guarantees and all. He dismissed it. He said that is for the technical people. He was looking at the bigger picture of the global order, which they seem to be now, which we seem to be actually, the dice is already rolled, and I don't think there's no turning back. And so I think the ground is set for some very dramatic changes. As far as India is concerned, which you asked, I think people here have to digest very fast. And I think the next few months are going to be, the American establishment is going to be consumed by handling this relationship, the Russia relationship, the Europe relationship. I don't think they'll have much time for India in the midst of all this. But we'll have to see how this triad of the United States, Russia, and China, and to some extent Europe, which is the fourth part of the, let's say, the Quad, fits in. So to the extent that we are seeing a very rapid rapprochement between the United States and Russia, to the extent that you're even going and talking so emphatically about lifting of sanctions and everything else, means that we should, by the end of the year, be facing a world in which the United States and Russia are at a very different place. And that might open opportunities for India. Sitting in Beijing, I'm not so sure how they would be reacting to a friend like Russia getting involved in this process with the Americans. Similarly, insofar as Europe is concerned, clearly they knew this was coming. All of us who've been interacting with various people knew that the Europeans had enough forewarning. There's little love lost for Donald Trump in Europe. But it is absolutely not the case that they were taken by surprise. Maybe they were taken by surprise by the speed, but not the direction of the change. And so I think insofar as Europe is concerned, I think it's an even deeper problem and crisis than people imagined. European unity is under immense strain. So as we speak, I think we are living perhaps a 1991 moment with 2025 characteristics.
I think that is a very, very professional and competent encapsulation of a very, very difficult subject. I think I personally have jotted down 2 or 3 questions which I'll ask you later. But given the note on which you completed, I'm going to upend the sequence in which I was originally going to ask our panel to speak. So instead of going to Dr. Kashan, I will go to Enola, because the final words that Mr. Saran spoke were about Europe and the difficulties that Europe is going through. And it is indeed true that he suggested that Europe was not surprised. But judging by the reactions and at least the level of confusion, do we send troops, do we not send troops, the different reactions, there seems to be a certain amount of confusion. And I'm sure Enola here will remove those cobwebs for us and clear and give us a clearer vision of where Europe is. Enola, the floor is yours.
Um, Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Ionela Cholan and I'm working in Brussels, so I know very well the way how the organizations are thinking. Regarding your question, I will start by addressing that and shed some light about what's happening currently in Europe and the views from the European Union. Um, Indeed, the Europeans, we were expected to have a sort of change in the transatlantic relations. We already faced that during the first Trump administration, where the trust between the transatlantic partners was quite low. So we were expected move, a pivot from Washington to Indo-Pacific. But as the speaker, Mr. Ambassador, mentioned before me, the speed. The speed was very fast. Uh, Very few people in Brussels were expecting it that the disruption of the transatlantic partnership to happen that fast. There is also the way how usually the transatlantic relations for the past 8 decades was played. Uh, there were crises in the transatlantic partnership throughout the past 8 decades. Most of those crises were resolved within closed doors. Most of the situation where the allies had different understanding of a situation, they tried to have an honest opinion and expressed, talk before having public declarations. So this is something new. But I would also want to share the fact that it might look now like the Europeans are confused, but if something that I learned from 12 years of studying the history of the European Union, because I also have a PhD on the European Union, is that actually the European Union is very good at resisting and coming out stronger from crisis. Why the situation is that hard for the Europeans to find the common ground is the fact that we are having 27 states with 27 domestic politics agendas, plus various threat perceptions and economic and national interests. But at the end of the day, I believe that for most of the Europeans, the fact that the outcome of the war will affect the security architecture in Europe, it's a reality. Also, for the Europeans who, until now, didn't wake up and they believed in the fact that the war in Russia, it's just a regional conflict, we can solve it and then we can move back to business as usual with Russia. It's not anymore on the agenda, because we are understanding that and this is the position of the European Union, we need to put Europe in a position of strength throughout these peace negotiations. And we should have both Ukraine and Europe as part of the negotiations, and that Ukraine should be provided with strong security guarantees. We need to have a just and lasting peace in Ukraine as a condition for a strong transatlantic security and as a condition to make sure that there might be no further future attack from Russia against Ukraine or another part of the eastern flank in Europe. So the fact I want to add some elements because President Trump is stating that United States had helped a lot. The Ukrainians and Europe are lagging behind, which is not a true information. I also have some numbers regarding that. So since the beginning of the war in the past 3 years, the U.S. Congress has appropriated around 183 billions of dollars for Ukraine. But apart from that, 58 billions um, were spent all in the United States and going directly to boost the US defense industry, either by replacing the old American weapons which were given to Kiev with new American made weapons, or by procuring new American made weapons for Kiev, or by making directing industrial investments. What the European Union and its member states did, we provided up to now. I will also use dollars as to have the same currency. 145 billions of dollars in financial, military, humanitarian, and refugee assistance. And in addition to that, last year, the European leaders agreed to commit another 54 billions until 2027 for the Ukrainian facility to support Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction, and modernization as part of the European path for Ukraine. Because, as you know, now Ukraine is a member candidate for the European Union. It's in this European integration path. So the total amount of what the Europeans have provided, and here I refer to the European Unions, taking out what the Brits and the Turks are doing, it's that we provided around 174 billions of dollars. So the difference is not that big. And why I mentioned that in this discussion, because these days there are a lot of discussions in Brussels if we'll have a partial or full retreat of the American support in Ukraine. Do Europeans have the capacity to step in and support Ukraine if they would want to not accept the peace negotiations because they believe that the conditions are unfair for them? We are discussing that, and it's important that we started this process. I would also want to add the fact that the war in Ukraine has also brought out a new dimension for the European Union. European Union was created as a peace organization. It was created after the Second World War as an organization to bring the European countries together and resolve those conflicts at the negotiation table and not through wars. Because throughout our history, we really fought against each other quite a lot. So what we are seeing is that European Union didn't have the security and defense policy. The only thing that we had for the past 2 decades was this crisis management operations, where we were trying to stabilize and provide peacekeeping operations in our neighborhood, stabilizing the neighboring countries. What we are seeing now with all this possible retreat of United States from Europe and the dramatic change of the American policy, it's also a lot of questions about the credibility of NATO, North Atlantic Alliance, and also about the credibility of Article 5. And unfortunately, some of the messages that are coming from Washington are not very encouraging. But this is the feeling of some of the Americans or some of the Europeans. My personal opinion is that we are in the eye of the storm now. So it's very hard for us being in the middle of this whole emotional declarations to understand if there is a logic, a pattern, or a strategy of the Trump administration. There are American voices who are saying that actually there is a strategy. A strategy is called pressure and then engage. And we are now in Europe and maybe on other also sides, on the pressure point of the Trump administration against the Europeans to do more for their security and defense. We had a visit of Secretary of Defense Hetzek in Brussels last week, and he mentioned that the Americans are expecting the Europeans to pull the burden sharing in NATO, commit more than that 2% GDP on defense. President Trump is saying 5% GDP for defense. That's basically increasing the defense investments across Europe, and for the Europeans to become net security providers for the conventional security of the European continent. So this is the direction. I believe that we are having a change in the transatlantic relations, but the interdependence among ourselves is that great that what will happen in Europe will also affect United States, and economically might affect the United States. So that's why I believe that it's very important when we are having these peace negotiations for the Europeans to have a seat at the table and to make sure that we are still supporting the preservation of the multilateral system, the liberal world order, where the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the countries are respected. When a state aggressor is considered a state aggressor, because invading a country, it's considered an aggression. So we should say the things as they are. When it comes to security and strong security guarantees, because this is the main discussion this week in Brussels, it's what type of security guarantees the Europeans can provide to the Ukrainians. Of course, the discussion is about also the armament capabilities, what the Europeans can provide, plus the financial support, those discussions about European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, according to some of the ideas that are coming from the American peace plan. The Europeans don't agree with some of those ideas, which we already are discussing in the public sphere. We have to take into account that we only have a partial view of the whole image, because, of course, we only have some bits and pieces of the whole discussions and the whole perspective. So that's why I'm trying not to have like very definitive answers, because as a researcher, I cannot read minds or predict the future. So I prefer to stay on the reading of what we have now, and the situation is quite volatile. But it's important to for the Europeans, when we are discussing this troop peace making operation or deterrence troops, or however we want to call them, to understand their role, mission, objective, if those troops are also deterrence troops, and in order for them to provide credible deterrence, of course, they need to be covered by Article 5 of NATO. And as we saw in the declaration of the British Prime Minister, the European boots on the ground in Ukraine, they need to have the American air support. This is a dependence that we created within NATO for the past decades. And currently, it's a strategic gap that we have in our European dependence. It's also a way to show the Americans that since they are part of this peace negotiations, they also should help in making sure that that will be a lasting, durable peace in Ukraine by also providing some parts of the support. In terms of security guarantees, well, for the Europeans and for most of the Europeans, the main security guarantee that we can provide to Ukraine is Article 5 of NATO. So also including the discussion about a NATO membership in the discussion for the peace negotiations. We know that this is an idea which was taken. It's an idea that the Ukrainians want, but was taken out from the discussions by the Trump administration. We are still in the early stages. I believe that what President Trump is doing these days is also a way in trying to discuss with President Putin in finding a common ground for build that negotiation discussions. This is, of course, just the start of a very long process of negotiations. I'm confident that within all this fog of information and confusion that it's coming out from Europe, but also from United States, we'll find the right direction. And the right direction is that to making sure that Ukraine will remain an independent state, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine will be respected, that we can provide the just, comprehensive, and lasting peace, because a peace that guarantees the interest of Ukraine. And this is the position of the Europeans. And the Europeans will try to find a way how we can provide more financial and military support for the Ukrainians, and will stand together with the Ukrainians in these peace negotiations, because we cannot have a discussion about peace negotiations without Ukraine at the table and without Europeans at the table, or at least being consulted and their opinion being integrated in these discussions.
Ola, thank you. That was, I have to use the word brave, a brave attempt to try and explain to us the multiple reactions that are coming out of Europe at this point of time. It obviously generates several questions which can be posed to you later, but I would like to flag two of them so that you can think about it when we come to the question point. One is, you spoke about European commitment to Ukraine and all that. But the problem is that, as far as I understand, that neither are European troops in Ukraine acceptable to Russia. They are not going to accept it. And if the Russians don't accept it, the Americans are saying that Article 5 will not apply. So there is a bit of a problem there. And how do you see the evolution of this new European security architecture? The second question is a little bit more, I don't know, maybe provocative. Are European businesses waiting to go back to Russia? And with those two questions to you for your response later, let me now go to what, in my opinion, will be the star of the show, for the simple reason that I would like Dr. Kashin not only to talk to us about where Russia is and the current negotiations, but before that, I would like him to also tell us about what is the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Where have we reached? I mean, even if there is, let's say, a ceasefire or a peace tomorrow, what is the actual sort of disposition of forces on the ground between Russia and Ukraine? The second is that there was a lot of optimism expressed by both, Mr. Saran referred to it, by the American delegation and the Russian delegation after the talks in Saudi Arabia. But there are still many tricky issues involved in the negotiations that were likely to take place. And here I would like to ask a simple question. When European security architecture was discussed in 1988, when we were talking of reunification of Germany and all, it was done between the Soviet Union and United States without Europe in the room. It was done in Malta between George Bush Sr. and Gorbachev. And it is only subsequently that Thatcher, Kohl, and all came and supported whatever was the agreement. So, is it logical to expect that today the same is likely to repeat itself? That the United States and Russia are going to work out something between themselves, and then somehow or the other, the Europeans are going to be brought into an understanding at the table. The floor is yours, Dr. Kashan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the Ukrainian situation and developments with you. So first of all, concerning the general dynamics and the situation, actually, the dynamics has been pretty much the same since the failure of the Ukrainian offensives in summer 2023. And since that time, the situation has been steadily deteriorating for the Ukrainian side with gradual increase of our progress, which became faster. The key thing was that even during 2024, when European Union and United States worked in concert to supply Ukraine, they were not able to change the dynamics. We were able to replenish the losses in both personnel and equipment better and faster than the opposing side. Actually, the Ukrainians were not able to cover their ongoing losses in personnel, and that was recognized by the Ukrainians. That allowed us to achieve very significant progress basically since February 2024. The deepest change was the fall of Avdiivka, which was the main Ukrainian fortress in Donbass, their key position. And since that time, we managed to achieve very spectacular progress. Well, we had contacts, track 2 contacts with US during Biden administration on several channels. And there was always clear understanding from the American side that the dynamic was not sustainable. I should say that even if Kamala Harris won the elections, we would have negotiations by now, and it wouldn't happen that dramatically, and they would take more into account the European sensibilities, but the logic would be basically the same. And because there was clear understanding from the US side that the longer they wait with the negotiations, the worse their position would be. Like, no one who followed the dynamics on the field had any illusions about the Ukrainian possibility to reach any kind of position of strength. So we would have negotiations anyway. In this particular case, as it is absolutely clear, negotiations started immediately after the Trump's victory in presidential elections. They continued for quite a long time, secretly and unofficially, and the very fact that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's phone talk on February 12th was publicly declared. It just signifying that before that time they achieved mutual understanding on key issues. Some details will have to be worked on, and there will be a lot of work to force Ukrainians and Europeans to accept the conditions. We don't know some of them exactly, but my understanding that it will be more or less based on Vladimir Putin's position, which was expressed during his meeting with leadership of Ministry of Foreign Affairs in June 2024. I believe it's becoming increasingly realistic. Why is it possible? It is only possible because of the revolution which happened in the United States, revolutionary change affecting primarily US internal policy, but also as a result, consequently, some important elements of US foreign policy. In some cases, positions which used to be critical for the US foreign policy for decades and which created a lot of conflicts and difficulties for the Russian-US relations, they're disappearing without us even doing anything or asking Americans to do anything. The best example is destruction of US aid, which was a very problematic agency for us, which was doing a lot of work in the post-Soviet space, financing a lot of anti-Russian activities which we found problematic. Now they just destroyed it, and that's great. That's just removing one of the main problems in the Russian-American relations. The US position towards military presence in Europe is also quite different from any previous administration, and we know how Trump, which political leaders Donald Trump sees as his role models, and these are American presidents of late 19th century, like President McKinley, like Theodore Roosevelt, president which pursued very unilateral, traditional imperialist foreign policy, a high level of protectionism in trade, very practical approach to international affairs, etc. So with this kind of United States, Russia simply has very few conflicts and contradictions. What the future might bring to us? First of all, Russia will not negotiate with Europe about the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict in any form. It's like excluded. Europeans might talk to the Americans, they might talk to the Ukrainians. We're not going to talk to Europeans. There will be at some point negotiations with the Ukrainian side. They will happen after the Americans talk to the Ukrainian side and tell them to accept some conditions. The Europeans might have some fantasies about supplying Ukraine unilaterally. That is not going to work, and everyone who follows the situation knows that for two reasons. Reason why, one is that even with US and European Union supplying Ukraine jointly in 2024, Ukraine was gradually losing the ground. Reason two is that not all of the US assistance, military assistance to the Ukrainian side can be expressed in money. The most important elements of this assistance were Ukrainian access to US information infrastructure. For example, the whole combat command and control system of the armed forces of Ukraine is totally based on Starlink satellite communication system, which is owned by Elon Musk, which can basically be turned off by one click of the mouse. They have their all communication, combat control information transmission based on this. They have Starlink terminals like from company battalion level and upwards, and it's just not going to work without it. Their whole targeting system is based on US satellite intelligence capability, and the Americans created a very innovative and sophisticated lifetime system of transmitting this information to the Ukrainians. If the Americans decide to turn it off, the Ukrainian military forces will be just blind. So even if the whole financing is in place, but the Americans just turn out satellite communications and satellite targeting, armed forces of Ukraine will collapse within like days, maybe weeks. If they do all of this together, Ukraine has no way to continue fighting. That will end very quickly, and basically everyone understands that. Russia doesn't see any perspective of improvement of relations with European Union after the war ends, and there is complete understanding between us and Europeans about that. There will be Iron Curtain in Europe after the war. We are not going to let European companies to return to Russia, at least on the same conditions as before the war. And the European Union political leadership is not particularly interested in that. There will be certain limited deals, possibly, but it's too early to say. That means that the main effects of the end of war and partial or complete normalization of the Russian-US relations will be felt by the Asian countries friendly to the United States, with the threat of secondary sanctions gone and US pressure to impose sanctions gone. We believe that there will be very fast growth in our relations with Japan and South Korea, and we had ongoing dialogue with the Japanese and South Korean all these years about rebuilding relations as fast as it is possible once the war is over. And of course, there will be massive positive effect on Russian-Indian economic relations that will give us a chance to balance our trade, because the Indian companies will be able to go to the Russian market without the fear of US secondary sanctions. Even if some of the US sanctions are not lifted, the administration of these sanctions will be different. So there will be no reason to fear for the Indian businesses working in Russia. What the end game might be. So my understanding that Russia will, of course, try to achieve results based more or less according to what Vladimir Putin said last year, which means 4 regions, no NATO, and certain limitations on Ukrainian military. Any Western troops deployed in Ukraine before the end of war will be prioritized as targets and attacked. Russia will never accept any peace deal which involves European troops' presence in Ukraine, and Americans have already said that they were not going to send any troops to Ukraine. So if there are peacekeepers, I believe it will be like usual countries contributing peacekeeping troops, some like South Asian countries, like, African countries, Latin Americans, some neutral players. Europe is the enemy, basically, so we are not going to accept this. Of course, there will be political change in Ukraine, which is coming fast, and we see that President Zelensky also feels that, so he made the first move. He imposed sanctions by Security and Defense Council of Ukraine on former President Poroshenko. Why? Because Pyotr Poroshenko is the only person in Ukraine who has his own political machine, like network of activists, media and stuff like that. So if he is allied to any popular figure like former commander Zaluzhny, they will just win any elections. In this case, Zelensky is doomed, and he's kind of looking to keep his power. For this reason, he is interested to continue the war. But he's being pressured by the Americans, and he has basically no way out. If they want, they just destroy the guy completely. About our relations with China, of course, if we have normalization of the relations with the United States, that means that we are not interested in creating difficulties for the US policies anymore. That doesn't mean that our relations with China suffer, but I think that Russian foreign policy at this point will look much more like Chinese foreign policy used to be in 2000s or early 2010s. There will be special relationship with China, but the policy in Asia will be very passive, and Russia will be aimed at diversification of economic ties and cultivating them with as many Asian countries as possible while staying away from the conflicts between them. As I said before, relations with Europe are expected to be very hostile by both sides, and that's not gonna change, but we are looking forward to firm ceasefire regime, so there will be no actual war fighting in Europe ever again, but there will be, of course, political hostility. We will work against each other actively in other regions of the world, like Africa and so on. So that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kashin. That was a very, I must say, very frank and eye-opening, even for me, view of Russia on the subject. I have a couple of questions. One is a more philosophical question. Do you share, I mean, Trump's administration, what we've heard from J.D. Vance at Munich and Hexet in Brussels and all, is essentially an attack on the liberal order as it existed in the world. Does this commonality, Russia used to say the same thing earlier, so does this commonality between United States and Russia, is this bad for Europe? Let's put it like that. Is this going to have an entirely negative impact on Europe's relationship with the United States, in your opinion? The second question I have is related to the last part of your address about Russia's relationship with China. Some of it, to my Indian ears, were like music, but I just want to clarify and be clear that I understood correctly. Suppose there is a sharpening of the relationship, or it becomes more adversarial between China and the United States. What I understood from your words is that Russia would actually behave like China is behaving in the Russia-Ukraine war. In other words, neutral, obey all sanctions, and never do anything that would upset the United States too much. Would that be the position that Russia takes? But before I let you answer those questions, I know you want to leave early. I will allow you to leave early. But before you answer those questions, I would ask our distinguished fellow at ORF, Mr. Rajiv Sinha, who's had many years in the government, to pass to us some of his wisdom on what he's heard from the three panelists.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to hear all of you here. And in fact, the discussions are rather eye-opening, and some of the it's interesting to see how things are going to pan out. And I think it's very clear from the American perspective what Washington wants in terms of the end game in Ukraine. And I think that's in sync with what Moscow is looking for. And that leaves Europe at a loose end. There's no doubt about that. And but one thing that I'd like to ask Chilan, in fact, is why is it that you see Russia as the enemy? Why? And sometimes I find that very difficult to understand as to, you're both Christian, you're both European, you're both white stock, and yet you see Russia as the enemy. And I don't think Russia has really attacked the heartland of Europe ever, if you look at it. So I don't understand that. So that's one thing that kind of I find difficult to understand. And at the end of the day, peace in Europe is something that everyone's worked so hard for ever since the end of the Second World War. And I think that should continue and not fall apart, because that's going to be a problem issue at the end of the day. And Europe has been rather peaceful. As you said, Europeans have fought each other majorly in the past, but in the recent past, Europe is rather quiet and peaceful, except for, I suppose, Serbia and then Georgia, the periphery, and now Ukraine. It's been quiet. It really hasn't had any this thing. So I find that very difficult to understand. And as far as Ukrainians are concerned, I think on the streets of Ukraine, from what I hear from my friends tell me, is there's a huge sense of fatigue. They want the war to end. They know they can't prevail. I think that's very clear. There's no doubt about that. And Zelensky actually is putting himself in an even more difficult position than ever before. So he knows, I think he has to understand that his game is up, and he has to kind of accept the deal. And well, I think President Putin himself made it pretty clear, even before President Trump kind of came out with his notions on what he wants in Ukraine, that I will deal with America, I'm not going to deal with Europeans. That is very, very clear. So I think that's exactly how it's panning out. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think Europe gains to stand much in terms of taking on an adversarial stand in what the Russians and the Americans want, because at the end of the day, if Ukraine is going to be on the losing side or losing the battle, then I think it'll have to accept what's coming its way. And as far as on the ground, what I see is that I see what happened in South Ossetia, in Georgia. I mean, it's still with Russia, and I suppose that's exactly what's going to happen in Donbass and Lugansk. The parts that are with Russia will probably stay with Russia. And that's what even the DC said, that yes, that's the way it's going to be. So, and I don't think Crimea is on the table at all, because that's completely a no-go area. So no one can even talk about it. So there is no doubt about that. And peacekeeping forces, well, as I don't see Article 5 being accepted by Russia. I don't see a European truce being accepted by Russia, and the other aspect being that if Article 5 is not part of the thing, part of peacekeeping on this thing, then it really is no go. It doesn't make sense at all. And I think Russia's ratcheted up not ratcheted up the tension, I think, but it's kind of reiterated the fact that the Bucharest invitation to Ukraine to join NATO has to be rescinded. And if that is the case, what is the strategic advantage for Europe to have Ukraine in NATO? I mean, that's something that we need to have greater clarity on. Is it worth fighting for? Is it worth the death and destruction that we've seen so far? Or is it something that, we just want it that way, that's why we will have it this way? So, I mean, that's something for Europe to decide and agree upon as to what the way forward in this aspect is. And I think I must say that Dr. Kashan's view on what the Russian position is, I think, is crystal clear, and it's good to hear. Good to hear that, because I think that's something that's been said on the sidelines quietly and clearly. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask Dr. Kashan to answer his questions, because he wants to leave early, with his permission, if there are any specific questions anywhere in the hall to Dr. Kashan, then please ask them now. I'll take 2 questions, let him answer, and then let him leave for his next appointment. Any questions?
is that when two parties meet, some compromises will have to be made, some give and take. What concessions is Russia willing to make?
Hi, my name is Ashutosh. So to question, my question is, so how do you think that is the possibility for Russia to become a member of G8 after, I mean,
Mr. Kashan, good afternoon. My question refers to what you just said. You said that after the US-Russia rapprochement, does not mean that the Russian policy towards China will change. If the Russian policy will be the same as that has been the Chinese policy in this conflict. I would just like to extrapolate the same situation. So, suppose there's an escalation of tension between India and China. Russia, having been a very long friend, time tested, trustworthy, and reliable all these years, what will be the Russian position in such a scenario where if the tension escalates between India and China?
Dr. Kashan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So first of all, I start with your questions, Nandan, concerning Europe and US and our understanding. So European leaders, they have correctly identified US Vice President's speech as intervention into internal affairs, and it was a revolutionary speech. US has revolutionary administration, and they want to export their revolution basically to Europe, to the area they are connected most with, and they obviously want their ideological allies, the European far right, to come to power in Europe as well. That creates a very interesting situation with long consequences. That means that if they succeed in exporting their revolution to Europe, then we'll have a completely new Europe in future, and we just cannot imagine how the situation evolves. If they fail, they just destroy transatlantic cooperation for very long time, because if someone intervenes into your affairs and tries to change your political system, it's a major irritant. So that's an important speech, and that's an important turn in US-European relations, which will become different, much more hostile. Our relations with China. So, of course, our relations with China remain tremendously important, and even now we are working hard to maintain our trust with Chinese. We explain to them that they have absolutely nothing to fear from normalization of the Russian-US relations, that there is no scenario under which we might work against them. However, we will, if there are no more major problems between Russia and the United States, there will be no more reasons for Russia to oppose United States globally. It's just completely useless in this case, nothing to fight against. That means that, yes, really, if there is, for example, American-Chinese confrontation, for example, over Taiwan, Russia just works according to the international obligations, which are all in Russian-Chinese treaty and joint declarations. That means that politically Russia says that China has its right to do with Taiwan however China pleases. They can take it by force, of course, but we are concerned and call on everyone to exercise restraint. We will never support any sanctions against China, and we will use this situation to boost our trade with China. At the same time, we are not going to engage militarily or do anything like to complicate the US actions as well. We'll just, seize the situation. Just like the Chinese, which increased their trade with Russia during the war in Ukraine, by like 100% and occupied large parts of Russian market. So I believe that will be it. Any possible conflict between India and China, it will be an absolute political nightmare for Russia. Russia always worked hard to prevent this, and now we have positive development because during the meeting between Indian and Chinese leaders at the sidelines of BRICS summit in Kazan, afterwards we saw a certain improvement in Indian Chinese relations, and Russia cannot, if there is another deterioration of these relations, Russia just cannot take sides. Russia will do anything possible to stabilize the situation and bring it back, and there will be, while maintaining relations with both sides, because it's like the worst thing which can happen to us, our two most important partners going against each other. If we talk about the possible compromises and concessions, it should be understood that discussion about Ukrainian issue has several dimensions. One dimension is territorial dimension. Basically, it emerged only by late 2022 when Zelensky finally ruined the Istanbul agreements and started to escalate. Initially, Russia was not going to seize any additional territory. By now, we declared that we will take 4 regions. It's put into constitution. We have to take 4 regions. But it's not the most important dimension of the crisis. The most important dimensions are military political ones. We will need to discuss a lot in details about the status of Ukraine and European security. And here there will be a lot of bargaining. First of all, Russia will and US will probably fight about the military situation in Ukraine. Russia will try to have as many limitations to Ukrainian military forces and Ukrainians' rights to conduct international military cooperation as possible. Because ideally for Russia, Ukraine should have small armed forces and very, very strong limits on any kind of international cooperations. Americans, even during the last months of Biden administration, were ready to think about certain limitations on long-range weapons, but not enough. That was not enough for us. And so it could be discussed at that time, theoretically, like they were open to discussing this. But now, of course, the situation is different. There should be certain discussion about the general military situation in Europe, because there are issues like US INF range weapons deployment in Europe, etc. It's all also included into general discussion, because it's going beyond Ukraine. Of course, there are a group of issues which Russia wants to bring into negotiations, probably brought into negotiations, but we don't know if Russia is capable to achieve. What Russia wants is basically removing the Ukrainian laws and regulations which ban any kind of use of Russian language officially, and any Ukrainian regulations aimed against the Russian Orthodox Church, because they banned the church and they're suppressing it rather brutally. So we will need to change this. I don't know if we succeed or not. So there are priorities, which are Ukrainians not going to NATO, no foreign troops in Ukraine, etc., like all these military limitations. And the territory, but there are a lot of specific issues in which probably neither side will get what they want to get. So it's like a difficult struggle. I believe there is some common understanding about the general principles, but I don't think that it will be easy to get results on any specific issues. And of course, there are separate negotiations between Americans and the Ukrainians. There is issue of Americans being interested in Ukrainian natural resources as compensation of their efforts. There is issue of political survival and future of Zelensky, because he knows that if he loses elections, there are plenty of people inside of Ukraine who will go after him, and all these people, they have nothing to do with Russia, but they're the ones that there are a lot of people whose assets were seized during the war by the Zelensky's allies. There was a lot of lawlessness and corruption during that time. A lot of people suffered, so there will be a lot of revenge. So he probably wants some kind of his own security guarantees, but that's between him and the Americans. So a lot will be going on. Probably in the end of the day, there will be compromise from all sides, but there are some things Russia cannot compromise on. For example, Ukraine is not going to any kind of NATO anytime. Otherwise, there is war. There will be no NATO troops in Ukraine, etc. Thank you.
My name is Pavan. What, in your opinion, is the future of NATO? And how you see it panning out in case, in fact, the support, in case of any other invasion by any other, in fact, country, the US doesn't provide the military support or military intervention. Thank you.
You mentioned in your talk that the European Union is ready to give peace guarantees in terms of deployment of troops, and also Article 5 guarantees of the NATO. So first, I think clearly that is out, because Article 5 of NATO will not apply. Then secondly, there are two major issues. One is that there's a difference of opinion between the European states themselves, because it is only the UK and France which are agreed to deploy troops, whereas Germany and other EU states, they are clearly against it and undecided. They have said that it is not, actually we're not yet reached that stage. I have been for the I think longest time, like people have been saying that EU needs to have a security policy and its own defense forces, but somehow that has not been agreed to by one of the most, I would say, the strongest economies, that is Germany. And also the EU, during the last 75, 80 years, in the post World War II security order, it has the habit of looking over the shoulders to the US for guidance and directions, not only in security and security policy, but also foreign policy and other monetary policies also. So in such a situation, how do you propose that the EU will go against a very rigid US administration this time? Thank you.
In any order you feel like, please, the floor is yours.
I will start with the last question, because I'm working on this already for 1 year and a half of the Martin Center. We have one of the, let's say, most comprehensive policy research paper in Europe about how the European Union can build the European Defense Union, which is basically building its security and defense policy, which strengthens the European pillar of NATO, but also provides the European Union to support NATO, because we consider that NATO, it's not enough to cover all the security threats for the European continent. Security are not only conventional, so we have a lot of hybrid threats. So for that, we believe that we need both the European Union and NATO to work together. So yes, to answer shortly, yes, the European Union, not only that needs a security policy, we need a security and defense policy. The member states are waking up, in the past 3 years, basically, we see a revolution inside the European Union in the fact that member states are accepting letting the European Union to work more on that, because traditionally defense was considered the national competence of the member states. And now we have for the first time a commissioner for defense and space within the European Commission architecture. The commissioner, in the name of former Prime Minister of Lithuania, Andrius Kubilius, he's working at this moment with the High Representative of the External Action Service, Kaja Kallas, another person coming from the Baltics, from Estonia, on the first white paper for the future of European defense, which will be launched in March. And we see the fact that the member states are actually starting to do more on defense together. There was this fear of some of the member states letting the European Union to do more on defense because they believe it as weakening NATO, and basically they didn't want it to compete with NATO. But now we have a clear delimitation of tasks. NATO will remain the main conventional alliance for the European continent, and they are the ones who are doing defense planning because they have the capacity for 75 years. The member states are the ones who have the armies, so we will not have a European army because we don't have a NATO army. The member states have army. This is a national member states competence. But the European Union will help the member states to create a European defense market, to do more together on joint procurement, to do more together on defense innovation, to do more together on military mobility, making sure that our infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, is also capable enough to support military purposes. To do more on also restructuring the way how we are conducting our crisis management operations, because the European Union will remain active in that element as well. And also, there are also discussions, but this is just a very narrow academic policy, just a small group. This is not a political discussion yet in Europe. This is just an academic discussion about if we should also have a European nuclear deterrent and how that can be provided in the worst case scenario that the Americans will not provide the nuclear deterrence for Europe anymore. So there are attempts on that regard. And the researchers and the think tankers in Europe have been working on that for many years. We lacked the political will. And the changes that we are seeing now in the United States actually will probably frighten some of the politicians. And in this crisis, I also see an opportunity. The European politicians will wake up, so they will do more. Because the citizens and the European citizens will start to be afraid about the threat of a large-scale war in Europe. Because I know that the Russian professor didn't said about that there will be another attack in Europe, but let's be frank. President Putin, he only understands strength, and he will see any outcomes of the war in Ukraine as a victory for him. He will not stop there. He will try again, because he has a maximalist approach towards Ukraine, and then he has a maximalist approach towards the European continent. And this also answers to the question of why the Europeans are seeing Russia as enemy. Actually, Europeans don't want to see Russia as enemy. For 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, we tried to integrate Russia in all that European and also some NATO collaboration that happened across the Europe, and we had 2 decades of let's say maybe 1 decade and a half of substantial cooperation. Let's remember that the Russians work with the Americans and the Europeans against the threat of terrorism and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So we had the change, and let's remember that the European Union had the strategic partnership with Russia. And in the early 2000s, there was this very positive outlook that there are papers there, if you are looking online, that are speaking about the possible Russian integration in the European Union. So this didn't come from the Europeans, because Europeans try to provide the same, open relationship to the Russians, but the Russians, they have this imperialist ideas that Russia is a great power, without realizing that we are not living anymore in the 19th century, or neither in the early 20th century, where we had the Soviet Union. Russia today doesn't have a stronger economy than, I don't know, Texas or Spain. So in terms of comparing the Russian strength, economic, political, soft power, cultural, technological, at global level, Russia, it's just a small piece comparing to the power of the European Union. And also on military as well, because the Europeans are investing more on military than the Russians. Russia is more aggressive. Europeans, they tended to be, we understood the lessons of the two world wars, and we try to do the best to prevent a future war in Europe. So to answer also the question on Germany, Germany preferred to, even though it has a strong economic capability, preferred not to have a military capabilities. But the threat that the Russia might not stop, and there are discussions that after this meeting between the American representatives and the Russian representatives in Riyadh, the Russians asked the Americans to a split of the European continent, a sort of Yalta II, where a return to the sphere of influence in Europe, where Central Eastern European countries, which are now most of them are part of NATO and the European Union, to be in the Russian sphere of influence. This is something that it's not acceptable for the Europeans. We don't believe anymore in sphere of influence. We believe in cooperation. And the fact that Europe is such a strong trade and economic partners to many places around the world, it's a proof that we really try to avoid this maximalist, aggressive military approach in our trade and political relations to other parts of the world. So yes, I feel like the Europeans will do more on defense, because they will be forced to do more on defense on one side, because the Americans, they are very clear that they cannot provide the support for Europe, not because they don't want it, because part of the American society, they are favorable of the European society. Culturally, we are very close together. And also historically, there are a lot of connections, and the trade between the European Union and the United States, it's the largest trade partnership in the world. So there is a strong dependence there that no matter of the Trump disruptions, that will continue and will be salvaged. We have to keep in mind that the Americans, it's not only the Trump administration. We also have the Congress. We also have other parts of the American society who are opposing this, some of these ideas that are happening. And we don't know for sure if what the Trump administration now it's doing, it's really total retreat from Europe, or it's just a way for him to show the stick before showing the carrots. The Americans have many national security interests, and they are interested in Europe to be saved from a future conflict, because otherwise they will have to continue staying involved in the, in the European continent, and they don't have, realistically, they don't have the military capabilities to be on two theaters of war. That's the issue. That's why also former Biden administration and current Trump administration has this idea of parking Russia. somehow resolving the issue in Russia, for them to look at what's happening in Indo-Pacific and containing the global rise of China. But the Americans will need allies, and they will need the support of the Europeans, because Europe is one of the most important economic players in the world, in terms of technology development as well, in terms of political power and soft power as well. And the Europeans will try to push forward in making sure that we'll have a stable and sustainable peace in Ukraine, a long-term peace, that the Russian will understand that this is the red line. No more wars, no more trying to dissolve the Ukrainian state, no more trying to conduct further hybrid attacks on the European continent, because the European Union really tries to preserve United Nations Charter, all the international system of values, treaties, principles that we have after the Second World War, because we understand that this brought more peace in the world and brought more development and benefits also for the countries in the global south. I know that this globalized system, it's not the best, but it's the best from what we had so far in our history, if we are realistic. To the question, future of NATO, if in the case that the United States will not provide military support for an attack, the idea is to develop the European pillar of NATO, making sure that the Europeans can support the protection of the conventional security and defense of the continent by themselves. This is possible. We just have to have a coherent, united approach together. And I will highlight again, this situation is an opportunity for our leaders to find the political will. We have all the other means. We need the political will. And I'm an optimist, and I believe that the European Union will go out of this crisis more strengthened and more powerful. And it will become also a strong voice in security and defense. We might see more also security and defense partnerships with countries from across the world. Here, maybe also India. Who knows? Based also on the interest of the Indian state. Returning now to the first two questions. Are the European businesses waiting to go back to Russia? In my honest opinion, I don't think that they're waiting. They already made sure that they went to other markets. Russia is not such a big market anymore for the Europeans. The European Union has signed recently, a couple of months ago, this Mercosur trade deal with the Latin American countries. We're trying to create more trade partnerships in Southeast Asia. We are trying to engage more with countries from Central Asia, because they want to balance more between the Russian and Chinese influence. So they are trying to come more towards the European Union. So that also shows the power of soft power of the European Union, because European Union is a credible and actor.
I'll ask you to
Yeah.
wind up in a minute or so, because
Okay, I have another comment to make, and then we can close. You also have the question about the future security architecture for Europe. And the future security architecture for Europe, according to the European views, sees Ukraine as an independent and sovereign state. This will be very important, and this is the crucial element for the European perspective. And Russia will have to make concessions. Russia is not the winner of the war. Actually, if we are looking at the war is in a stalemate for 3 years. Russia believed that will be a 3-day invasion, which they said then 3 weeks. it turned into a three-war invasion for which they had to ask for support for the North Koreans, the Iranians, and some support from the Chinese in order to preserve in this war. So they are not winning. It's a stalemate. So that should also for them to be clear that they also have to make concessions and that the Ukrainians will have to agree to that peace deal. It shouldn't be enforced on the Ukrainians.
I mean, I understand and do appreciate that Europe is going through a very difficult period. There will be a lot of changes. There's a lot of debate that has to occur within Europe before you expressed optimism about the emergence of a new defense and security organization in Europe, as well as strengthening of defenses. But I think there is still a long way to go till that emerges. But thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for spending so much time and trying to explain to us where Europe is today. And now I turn to Mr. Pankaj Saran. I have a couple of questions. I will take 3 questions from the hall after that, and then we will ask him to give his final opinion as well as answer these questions. The first question I have is related to what I asked Dr. Kashan. Do you think that now with the improvement in the relationship between Russia and the United States, in case of an exacerbation of the relationship between China and the United States, that Russia will tilt away from China or remain neutral, at the very least, which effectively would mean tilting away from China? That is question number 1. And question number 2 goes back to actually what is in the title of this paper. Will the war end in 2025? These are my 2 questions. If there are any questions from the hall.
Ambassador Saran, a two-fold question. The lessons India can draw from the way Russia has conducted itself diplomatically and militarily. And would you subscribe to this view that India might risk falling into the trap of the big so-called big powers dividing, the world into spheres of influence? Number 1. And number 2, if assuming Trump is pivoting to the Indo-Pacific, is that necessarily good for India, or you think it will risk further divisions in the Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
All such easy questions. So let me start with yours, Nandan. We could actually land up in a situation where we have a Russian version of non-alignment, where if you have a situation in the next couple of months or next year where the normalization between Russia and the United States stabilizes, what they've talked about right now is extraordinary. They have talked about resumption of full diplomatic relations and everything else. So it's really at a very high speed. So if there is stabilization and beyond, and that's what I take away from the public comments made, I have no doubt in my mind that the ask from the Americans to the Russians is not going to be limited only to Russian behavior in Ukraine or territorial concessions. It is going to relate to the broader geopolitical construct and Russia's foreign policy choices vis-a-vis China. And this, to my mind, is going to be much more difficult for Russia to handle than territorial concessions. Because basically, if you're asking Russia to distance yourself from your closest strategic partner, and if that is the price that is being demanded from you for your reintegration into the Western economic and political sphere, G7, etc., then it's a tough price to pay. And so to answer your question, I think this is going to be a difficult choice. But from whatever we've seen in the last 1 week, 10 days, the Russians are going in with open eyes. And since diplomacy is all about defining your own limits to choices, because no choice is absolute, we will have a situation where Russia will have to take its own decisions on how much to disengage with China. There will be areas and sectors where the demands from the Americans are unacceptable to the Russians. But there could be areas and sectors where the Russians may be ready to live with American demands. So strategic disengagement and its extent from China is, in my opinion, going to be the defining point of this whole exercise. But what is really extraordinary in all of this is that the solidity of the Western transatlantic alliance today, the way we are discussing it and talking about it, is unimaginable. This was supposed to be the bulwark of the current global order that we have inherited after 1945. And so today, if that is coming into question, it is really serious. So you have a situation where Europe seems to be caught between Russia on one hand and the United States on the other. And so the distinction between friend and foe is getting blurred. And if you are sitting in Beijing and watching all of this, Beijing is seeing where this is headed. And there are no free lunches in this peace deal, because what Trump is offering Russia is rehabilitation. And there will be no free lunches. Russia will have to give something, will have to pay. Secondly, on the question of whether the war will end in 2025, I think this is a moot point. Of course it's going to end. I mean, I don't see, the question is not whether, but the question is whether it'll end in the next 1 month or the next 3 months. Because remember, as I said earlier, this is on top of Trump's international foreign policy priorities. He has been shouting from the rooftops, he and his ideologues, that this war has to end yesterday. So I have no doubt that this is going to be his first order of business before he embarks on his other foreign policy priorities. So to answer your question, yes, yes, and yes, for sure. The question whether, if you recall, the whole of 2020 was spent by the Trump administration in negotiating with the Taliban, because he had determined that he will walk out of Afghanistan. Whether his allies liked it or not, whether India liked it or not, or whether anyone else liked it or not. But once he had taken that strategic decision, the deal was wrapped up with the Taliban. It was a bad deal. Most Western allies still criticize it heavily. But he took the decision and he signed the deal. The implementation was done by President Biden. So this is somewhat reminiscent of that kind of a strategic determination. On the third question of lessons, which is very interesting from how the Russians have diplomatically and militarily behaved, well, there are lessons. I don't know how many we can follow, but I think the lesson we have to draw is that, you know, your core national security interests are non-negotiable. And I know that the Europeans hate the concept of the sphere of influence. But my view is that every major power in the world has practiced this doctrine, but under deniability. I mean, the Americans of the good old times regarded the entire world as their sphere of influence, and not to speak of Latin America and South America. The Europeans have an existential security concern when it comes to North Africa to prevent illegal migrants flooding Europe. So it may not be their sphere of influence, but it is certainly something which is of sphere of concern. So the lesson for us is that you have to have a dogged single-minded determination to protect your core national security interests as you embark on, and not allow yourself to be hemmed in by hostile powers. You also have to have a very robust defense industry, an indigenous defense industry. You have to reduce your dependencies on other partners, and you have to have national will. Russia is one of the few countries in the world which has lost millions and millions of young men in world wars, in the Ukraine campaign. They have not wilted. And this is what the Europeans actually do not like about the Russians, the sheer exhibition of hard power. So on the sphere of influence, of course, I have mentioned that we are seeing a situation where, President Trump has also talked about meeting the presidents of Russia and China together. So he's taking the bull by its horns. He's trying, let us see, it's very early days, but he thinks the big boys can arrange the world. This, in my opinion, will open up opportunities for us, some of which were actually hinted by Professor Kashin, and I agree with that. For example, the India-Russia economic cooperation could see a revival to achieve its natural potential, which was not possible because of the sanctions. On the President Trump's shift to China and the Indo-Pacific, again, he's throwing out mixed signals. But what is clear, if you look at his ideologues and you look at the literature coming out from his associates, there is no doubt that if there is any country in the world or any power he regards as a challenge to American supremacy, it's the Chinese. Now, the question is, how is he going to address that? And I think we still have to see how this pans out. And his actions are not making it easier for us to decipher how he will go about this business. The plucking Russia away from the Russia-China axis is a very, very critical, fundamental piece of this jigsaw puzzle. But the fact that the reason why it's difficult to us to decipher is that he's riding on two horses. He's got one set of very close advisors who are China hawks, and he's got another equally close set of advisors who have huge stakes in the Chinese economy. So he is riding these two tigers, and it's a clever way to govern, and both are fierce loyalists, of Trump. So which way and how will he go? So maybe it's issue-based. On some issues, you might have a G2, a kind of a condominium. In some issues, you might have outright confrontation. But I would only say that on Taiwan, it's very interesting. He has basically said, it's not my priority.
Thank you very much, everybody. Sorry I'm being so authoritarian and winding up the discussion when it seems to be just heating up. But thank you all for participating. Thank you all for staying interested in this conversation. I know there are several questions which still remain in everyone's mind. Hopefully, these will be answered in the next few weeks. If not, I will ask Siddharth to once again convene all of us here, and maybe we could address it again. Thank you, Ilona, once again. And see you all.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for including the European perspective. We in Brussels, we are also interested in hearing India's perspective, and we hope to have more cooperation between the European Union and India.
Thank you.
Thank you.